Okay, well, good morning to everybody, and we're going to get started today. And so we're sort of finishing up the end of week 12 today. Excuse me, I've still got this allergy hanging on here. So we're going to cover the rest of chapter 14 today. We made a pretty good dent in it on Tuesday, and we're going to finish talking about the whole idea of money creation, what it's about. Remember, this chapters 14 and 15 kind of go together, really, because Chapter 14 sort of deals with the private financial industry, particularly that of banking, which is really the core activity of the financial world. That is the core business of taking deposits and making loans. It's really a core business. And so we'll talk a bit about their role, their unique role, frankly, in macroeconomics, which is unique to any other industry. And then we'll try to get into chapter 15, which deals with our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve. We've talked about them several times, and particularly in terms of what they do in terms of managing the money supply, managing interest rates. And now we'll finally get into really discussing what the Federal Reserve is about, what the history of it is, what their roles are, which are many. They've got a lot of different roles to play. And I'm sure that we will carry this into next week, so into next Tuesday. And that leaves us then really one final chapter. And really, these last two chapters, 15 and 17, deal with government policy. So chapter 15 deals with monetary policy and the role of the Federal Reserve. And chapter 17 deals with fiscal policy, which is budget policy, government taxation, government spending, and the actions of our federal government in particular, even though state governments and even local governments have got some role to play in fiscal matters. We're primarily talking here about fiscal policy in its role as stabilization policy that is trying to bring the economy to some stable, full employment level where there's stable prices and maximum employment. And that's really what the mandate is for government macro policy. And again, as I've said this numerous times in the course, almost every time in macro we use the word policy, we're almost always talking about government policy because there's really no other actor in the economy who can act to stabilize the entire global economy or even national economy. It's got to be government, and government is the only instrumentality that's got its hands on the switches to make these changes. If we're not finished with fiscal policy on Thursday of next week, which is week 13, we'll definitely carry that into week 14, which is our last regular class week. Well, before that class session ends, I'll simply cut off at around halfway through, maybe half an hour in, 9:30-ish, I guess, on Tuesday, a week from next Tuesday, in order to review for the fourth exam, which is scheduled for the back half of week 14. Then the last week is week 15, which is final exam week, and we'll talk a bit more about that. I don't like to usually get into more than one exam at a time. I just think it's easier to take it one at a time. And so right now the good news is, even though these are coming a little bit faster, as I mentioned back on the chapter, on the third exam, the reading material is less. It may not be any easier, frankly, it is what it is, but at least it's less, and there's less to really go over in order to be prepared for that exam. Same format as before, so if you've taken the first three exams, you should be fine. By the way, I mentioned this on Tuesday, that if you didn't take the third exam for whatever reason, I think we've got a couple who had some sort of issue, and I need to get back to at least one of you today, which I will. You can still make it up. You still got the opportunity until Sunday in order to do that. Shouldn't be any big deal. I'll simply make that available. Usually, I don't sort of like to open these up and keep them open multiple days. I sort of like to know what day you're going to take them. So that's why I sort of want to get a date in mind as to when you plan to take the makeup. So that'll be available for those who need to. You can probably still make up exam 4, but as I indicated in the syllabus itself, the makeup of the final exam, which is week 15, is probably going to be extremely doubtful, if not just outright impossible, simply because of the fact that CNN requires the final grades be turned in a pretty quick time turnaround. We were really busy those last couple of days, and so it's unlikely you'll be able to do that. Okay, so let's, other questions for me about anything? You can simply enter something in the chat box if you like. Okay, well, let's pick up from where we left off last time, if we could. And that was, we were talking about money creation And we were talking about a bank's balance sheet. And we talk about a balance sheet. For those of you who had accounting before, any accounting, I think probably, even high school accounting, the term balance sheet should be familiar to you. It's sometimes also known as the statement of financial condition. And that is, it's called a balance sheet because assets usually are presented on the left side. If it's in a report that sort of folds out like this, assets on this side, liabilities and equity on this side, that is owner's equity capital. And the two sides will balance, is the term balance sheet. And so with banks, what did we say was the key variable that we need to be understanding with regard to assets? The key assets to banks, once again, are loans and investments. And a big one, which we'll talk about, is reserves. And I'll talk much more about what reserves are. And then liabilities are primarily deposits. And this is far from an exhaustive list. I mean, if you look at any bank's balance sheet, you're going to find all kinds of sort of exotic things like interbank loans and repurchase agreements and all kinds of things like that. Real estate owned, which is foreclosed property that banks own and whatnot. When it comes to deposits, it'd be things like commitments to pay other banks for trade credit. That is paper that's by importers who have to pay companies from overseas. It's a lot of exotic stuff. And the only reason I bring it up is because I am aware that there is more going on than what we're talking about here. Okay, so but this is really this is really all that we need to know, because this is not an accounting course. This is an econ course. This is all that we really need to know in order for us to understand what the process of money creation is from the standpoint of the commercial banking system. Now, the government can produce its own money supply, and we will get into that when we talk about monetary policy in chapter 15. But for the most part, and when it does it because it's trying to achieve some particular objective. And in the last few years, and I mean really the last 20 years, frankly, with the exception of maybe a couple of years just leading up to the pandemic, really our Federal Reserve, which is really the agency of government which would put money into the economy on its own, has been engaged in that business, putting money in, as opposed to what? Well, as opposed to taking money out. And now we're seeing the Federal Reserve finally, last week or 2 weeks ago, I think it was last week, begin to pull it back in the other direction, to sort of reel the economy back the other direction, because we are pretty much at full employment. In fact, I've seen a number of economists who believe that we're probably even beyond full employment. That is, we're probably lower. Our unemployment rate is probably lower than full employment, mostly because of the fact that if you look at all the help wanted signs and all the wage increases that are going on throughout the economy, that's pretty indicative of a full employment situation, and maybe even a little bit beyond that. But I think it's going to be temporary. I can almost assure you it's going to be temporary, just given what we know about macroeconomics. The Federal Reserve has signaled another 11 more increases in interest rates. We've already seen mortgage rates rise by the fastest rate since 1987. That's 35 years ago. So, for those looking to refinance, unless you've got a really high rate now, you might have missed the boat on that. Maybe not, because sometimes what happens is, if the Federal Reserve has credibility about raising interest rates and heading off inflationary conditions like what we've got now, some of these long-term rates may actually fall while they're raising these short-term interest rates. And we see this happening from time to time. And and it's because the market says, okay, well, in the long run, inflation won't be a problem. 7 or 8% annualized inflation we've got at the moment would be interpreted as being not a feature of years down the road, because the Federal Reserve is serious about fighting inflation. That's if the Federal Reserve has credibility. I think they have to earn their spurs here, because I think they've, quite frankly, lost some credibility by talking endlessly all last year about how inflation was going to go away. It's just temporary, it's transitory, was the word they continually used. And a lot of people in the econ profession, I put myself in this category, said, I don't think it's temporary. And in fact, if anything, the inflation rate has gotten worse, not better. So while the pandemic has gotten better, not worse. I mean, the facts are there. It's just you have to sort of interpret it. So anyway, we will talk more about that. But let's go back to talking about money creation as a product of commercial bank lending. Let's just say, hypothetically, we've got two banks, okay, in the economy, and let's just say the economy consists of really two banks, the first bank and the second bank. And I'm going to tell you right now that we are going to simplify this analysis greatly by not including the actions of the central bank. And because I know that all textbooks, including your online textbook, will have examples that get pretty exotic with regard to reserves on deposit in the Federal Reserve, and they'll usually be somewhere like in the middle. And so every transaction at all, whether it's a deposit transaction or a loan, well, particularly deposit transactions, will involve some sort of debit or credit that is up or down relationship at the Federal Reserve. That's true. I want you to know I realize that it's there. I'm fully aware of it, but it's not really important for our purposes in order to really understand that. What we're mostly interested in doing here is to try to sort of piece apart the process of money creation and to show how it works in very simple terms. And I'm just going to go and show a couple of transactions just to sort of show how it does work. And I hopefully the simplicity will allow you to see how this whole process works. So let's say we start out, we've got assets on the left side, liabilities on the other side. And I realize that it's really liabilities and equity. I get that. Then we've got this sort of T account structure. Assets on the left side, liabilities on the right side. And yes, we would have capital accounts here like common stock and retained earnings and all that. So yes, we know that they're there. But again, we're talking about, excuse me, the core activities of a bank, that is deposit taking, loan making. So that's what we're really getting at. So we're going to say that we've got a bank that has $50,000 on deposit. So that is a deposit liability. Remember, bank deposits are liabilities to the bank. I hope I didn't make this too close together. It looks like I might have though, huh? So let me spread this out a little bit. We've got room to spread out here. So I'll put the second bank over here to give us more room. And what we've got, assets, assets and liabilities. And remember the definition of assets and the definition of liabilities. Assets are things which are owned. This is a very simple, quick and dirty definition. Assets are things which are owned. Assets or liabilities are things which are owed. So we have $50,000 on deposit at the first bank. And we've got $50,000 on deposit at the second bank. Okay. So this gives us what then? It gives us a beginning money supply. And we'll call this scenario, we'll call this condition 0, right? Condition 0, and that is the money supply is $100,000, $50,000 from the first bank plus $50,000 from the second bank equals $100,000. Okay, pretty simple, no problem there. But here's the beauty part of banking, and it's really what makes the banking industry sort of unique, I guess, is the sense that even though if you make a deposit to a bank, the bank calls it a liability, that is, they owe it back to you, and you certainly hope the bank does recognize it as a liability that they owe it back to you. It's also simultaneously an asset because they get to use it right away. In fact, every time you make a bank deposit, you're basically turning over legal title to that money. The bank can do with it whatever it wants within legal bounds, right? I mean, they can't, buy lottery tickets with it or something like that, or or bribe politicians, or there are all kinds of prohibited activities. But nonetheless, you get the idea. It's a simultaneous asset and it's a simultaneous liability, which is a pretty good thing to have. So, and the reason it's a reserve is because remember, why is it an asset? What is an asset? How's an asset defined as? I just gave you the definition of something which is owned, but in the accounting world, the more formal definition is that which has future service value created as a result of past transactions, i.e. the deposit now was a past transaction, which now becomes something of future service value. And the same goes with the other bank as well. So you've got $100,000 on deposit, that's condition 0, okay? And I guess I don't have quite as much room on the board as what I thought. So let's take scenario 1 here, okay? I'll write this up here a little bit. I think that'll probably be easier I guess I could swivel the camera here, but I'd like to kind of keep this on one board here. So scenario one is this, and it's simply a depositor of the First National Bank. Okay. Depositor of the First National Bank, or the First Bank, I guess, writes a check to a depositor of the Second National Bank. Okay, writes a check to a depositor of the Second National Bank. In other words, it's an order to pay of the Second National Bank. And it is for $10,000. Okay, for $10,000. All right, so what does that look like then? Okay, well, so if you're a depositor of the First National Bank, you're saying, okay, I want to claim on my $10,000. And so as a result, $10,000 has to be withdrawn. So as a result, deposits here fall. Okay, as a result of this. Also, reserves fall because the bank has to then lower reserves in order to do that because they have to pay out their own cash. So as a result, assets and liabilities both fall as a result. I guess what happens over here, the depositor of the Second National Bank makes a deposit here. And so deposits go up to 60,000. And that deposit simultaneously becomes an increase in its reserves. And so as a result, the reserves go up by $10,000. And so as a result, what is condition one here? Condition one is we now have $40,000 plus from the First National Bank plus $60,000 from the Second National Bank equals, well, it's $100,000. It's the same dollar figure. So the deposit function and the payments function don't really do anything to the money supply, okay? This is an important thing to know about, and it really doesn't do anything in order macroeconomically. All that is happening here is simply a financial transaction, which is why if you look at a textbook and some people will who want a little bit of extra review or a little bit of extra help will look at some of the self-help exercises, which I probably don't talk about enough, but how useful they are. And among those are, what are examples of things which impact the economy broadly? And a financial transaction usually, unless it's a loan transaction, usually doesn't really do anything. Even something like I buy stock in ABC Corporation, I've created no new value in the economy. The only value that would show up is maybe the income approach, and that's the commissions that I paid to a broker in order to make that happen. That's really it. There's no new activity really happening. And so just simply moving money around doesn't do anything. But let's take a different scenario here and see how it does do something. Let's take scenario two now, okay? And in this case, scenario two is a borrower borrows $30,000. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a customer of the Second National Bank. We're just saying it is a customer of the Second National Bank. A borrower borrows $30,000 from the Second National Bank. Okay, to buy a truck from a depositor of the First National Bank. From a depositor of the First National Bank. Yeah, I'm sorry if my handwriting is not the best. And we're going to say it's for $30,000. My handwriting is not the best, and I apologize for that. So a borrower borrows $30,000 from the Second National Bank to buy a truck from a depositor of the First Bank. Okay, well, what happens here is this. The First National Bank the Second National Bank is doing the lending here. And so as a result, it's going to pay it out of its reserves. That's its cash to work with. That's why a bank has reserves, is in order to work with that. So as a result, reserves to fall to 30,000, while loans go up to 60,000. Okay, loans go to 60,000. No, nothing has happened with deposits because that 60,000 is still owed to depositors. It's still, excuse me, it's still part of the money supply. It could be withdrawn tomorrow or today if need be, right? Then what happens over here? Well, the customer of the First National Bank now goes to the bank and has a check for $30,000, and so makes a deposit, and now it's $70,000. And simultaneously, reserves here go up to $70,000. And so now what we have with condition two, and that is scenario two, we now have what? We have $70,000 on deposit at the First National Bank. and $60,000 still on deposit at the Second National Bank. $60,000, and that equals now what? $130,000. The money supply has gone up by the exact amount of what? The loan should be 30,000. It's gone up by the exact amount of the loan, right? I was adding those together, and I should have it. Separate category. So the money supply increases every time a bank makes a loan. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? The idea is, and the reason why is because this 60,000 didn't go away; it's still there. But the reserves which a bank has to work with were drawn upon in order to make a loan, and then becomes new money. Where it becomes new money over here, because it is in fact money. It's real money that exists over here as reserve. And I know that there are some more mechanics of this where it maybe clears to the Federal Reserve. But if this is a local scenario where it's First and Second National Banks are in the same town together, they may just clear it directly between the two of them, no big deal. And today, increasingly, as we have electronic transactions where physical checks are used less and less all the time, in order to clear, that's why bank checks clear pretty quickly now. These things can happen very, very quickly. This increase in the money supply. So this really adds to sort of the speed of the economy, and really was an initiative that the government started at the beginning of this century, this 21st century, to try to make these more electronic imaging than actual physical checks. But there are still physical checks that are used, obviously. There are uses for physical checks, even though I think for most of us, we tend not to traffic in them quite as much. But hopefully this is clear as to what's going on, that the money supply has gone up by the amount of the loan. So money creation is a product of banks' lending ability, okay? And to the extent that banks can increase the money supply, they can do so. Now, the whole thing works in the opposite direction if borrowers are repaying loans. And here, let's say that we just repay it back off. So 30,000, it goes down here, it goes down here, and it simply goes back to, so it simply goes back to where it was before, back to $100,000 in the money supply. Not 130, but 100, if the borrower just simply repays it. But they're probably going to repay it over time, or whether it's an installment loan, or at some point in the future. Well, clearly at some point in the future, that's why you borrow money, is to repay it at some point in the future. And I realize that what we don't have here are lots of the many numerous accounts that go into a balance sheet, and we've also ignored the income statement here. I realize that, but it's not really the point we're trying to make. The point we're trying to get at is the money creation process that's going on within the banking system, which is pretty incredible to think about. And so you've got to ask yourself this: okay, this is a great business, right? People bring me their paychecks, they bring me their savings, and they bring me they sold a house, and they bring me a check from the sale of their house, and they put it on deposit with me. I owe it back to them. That's no big deal because I've got it to work with, and I can simply lend it, I can invest it, I can do what the heck I want with it, and I can make money on it. And I can pay them close to nothing. And I don't mean to be cynical, but frankly, in the last 20 years, bank deposits have not paid very much. In fact, they haven't even really covered inflation. And we haven't really even been talking about inflation except for really the last year. But there is pretty much always inflation, even though it's 1 or 1.5%, 2%. Well, you're not getting that in return on bank deposits. While a bank could invest in things like bonds and whatnot, and maybe get kind of a measly return there, but a pretty decent return. And so you have to ask yourself, how can a bank make a mistake? How can the industry get itself in trouble? And they get themselves in trouble when these things don't repay, because they still owe these people back their money. It's a liability, and yet this money could be gone if borrowers don't repay. So bad loans, it's losing money the old-fashioned way in banking, making bad loans. And bankers are notorious for getting in situations where loans and whole categories of loans go bad. I know when I first started in banking, a lot of banks were working off a lot of energy loans which were made to South American oil producers. There was a lot of oil discovered in South America, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and whatnot. And at one point, I remember I was about a year into banking. The entire nation of Brazil said that they were going to stop paying their foreign debts. Immediately, the banking industry went crazy, went berserk, or writing down debts and taking losses on loans, which translates to decreases in income, frankly. And so those are bad. And of course, most of us are somewhat in remembrance, at least, maybe not from personal experience, but the mortgage crisis of last decade, where I guess maybe it's now 2 decades ago, where a lot of bad loans were made, loans that should not have been made, and as a result, the banking industry really took a hit. And but as I mentioned last time, I think the best explanation for why that occurred was Jamie Dimon's explanation. He was and is the chairman of JP Morgan Chase, and he said, if my competitor is doing it, I've got to do it. So if it's kind of like, okay, it's crazy, but if everyone else is doing the crazy thing and doing earnings and market share and taking customers from me, I'm going to be crazy too. And the only thing pulling back the crazy is regulation. And I think there's ample evidence to suggest that the government did a very inadequate job of putting the kibosh on these really insane mortgage loans that were just proliferating in the early part of the 2000s. I was in banking at the time and saw it, and I thought it was absolute insanity. And don't take my word for it in terms of the criticism. The former chairman of the Federal Reserve, the guy who was in charge of the regulatory environment at the time, Alan Greenspan, in his autobiography said, we missed the boat, we messed up badly. It was his mea culpa. You can go read his book if you like. He himself is saying we did not do our due diligence in terms of one of the Federal Reserve's main functions by law, which was consumer protection. And I think there's no greater role of consumer protection than to keep people from losing their homes. I mean, what a devastating impact that is. So that eventually was really taken away from the Federal Reserve when a new agency was created. And so I really think it was something that never needed to happen, but it did happen. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything with regard to money creation and the bank lending process and whatnot. Okay. Well, let's do one more thing here, and then we'll I think we're going to move on to chapter 15, if I'm not mistaken. And that is this. There's something called the multiplier effect, and it really exists in many different places in economics. We didn't really cover this when it came to demand expansion. The idea that, let's say the government dropped $1,000 in every household, or let's say $1,400, which is that was a pretty that was like the last stimulus check that a lot of households got last year. Remember the stimulus checks? Maybe they weren't even checks, maybe they're direct deposits. But they were just sort of bestowed on households as a way to keep the economy going during the pandemic. It was just sort of money from the sky, and whatnot. And I know that for years and years we talked about these potential scenarios, and people would say, "Yeah, right, the government's going to just drop money on us." Well, what did the government do? And in 2021 and 2020, they dropped money on households. And they just really did. There's no other explanation. And look at the federal deficit figures to show that the federal government borrowed money in order to create cash to put in people's bank accounts so that they would continue to spend to keep the economy afloat during the pandemic. And it was arguably the right thing to do, unless you really don't agree that government has a role to play at stabilizing the economy. Unless you believe that, I think most people agree that something like that had to be done. But those stimulus days are done. I don't see it coming back. Occasionally, I look more than my share of financial press and economic articles, and I think there are occasionally voices that will say, there's another stimulus probably coming this year. I don't think so. Not from today's vantage point, March 31st, the last day of the first quarter of 2022. I don't think so. In fact, if anything, the government's probably going the other direction when it comes to fiscal policy. The president's talking about raising taxes, but raising taxes on the highest earners, because of all this discussion about the very highest earners really sort of evading taxes. I think it's a serious issue. The average person, which I think he defines as any household earning less than $400,000, I believe President Biden has defined as an average person. So will not face higher taxes. That's at least the way it's proposed, although Congress has to weigh in on that. But let's go back to the multiplier. So we didn't really talk about this when it came to deposit expansion or demand expansion, even though what these stimulus checks were about were to try to boost demand throughout the economy. Knowing what? Knowing if I had $1,400 in my bank account that I didn't have yesterday, I'm going to go do what? I'm going to go buy, I don't know, a used motorcycle. I'm going to take a vacation, or I'm going to buy school clothes, or a new computer, or new furniture. I'm going to create demand that my spending is someone else's income, right? And someone else's spending is my income, basically. Anybody who receives income is as a result of someone else's spending, frankly. And so if there's more spending, then it translates into more income. But yet it doesn't stop there, because the recipient of those funds then increases their spending. The business that I bought a new couch from is going to buy more new couches because to restock, right? Because other people are coming in. And so and the firms that make the couches are going to make more couches. And all along that value chain, all the way until it gets to my house, there are more workers being employed. It's what we call the multiplier effect. It's the ripple effect that translates outward from increases in demand or decreases in demand. It works in the other direction. Well, the same happens just with money itself from this money creation. And there's something called the monetary multiplier, the money multiplier, which is usually denoted by the letter small m, not the capital M, which we usually use to denote money supply components, M1, M2. But the money supply component is measured as this. It's the inverse of what's known as the required reserve ratio. Or sometimes it'll be just this required reserve ratio is represented as a capital R, but most people will refer to it as the triple R, required reserve ratio. What is that? We haven't talked about that yet. Well, it's one thing we haven't gotten into here, because when I talked about these reserves, what I didn't mention was, and I just didn't give it to you for simplicity purposes to illustrate the money expansion aspect, but it was the idea that if you make a bank deposit, some of those bank deposits, particularly if they go into the so-called transaction accounts in M1, some of it's got to be basically put on the bench, like a player who's no longer in the game. Sit on the bench and you stay there, don't go anywhere, right? In other words, that's money that can't be loaned, can't be invested. And only until about 2007 couldn't earn any interest, but it just sort of sat there out of play in the economy. Now, traditionally, up until, well, sometime later part of the 20th century, the initial purpose of reserves were to prevent against bank runs. Remember, we talked about bank runs. If everybody wanted their deposits back, it wouldn't be there. At least those reserves were a cushion that a bank could pull out in an emergency situation where everyone wants their money back, they could get at it. Today, bank runs are not very common. I mean, they still happen. I think we had, even during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, I think I only heard about one bank run. And if I'm not mistaken, it was on Washington Mutual. It was a savings and loan. But I think it was Washington State. And because they had a lot of real estate loans, mortgage loans, residential mortgage loans. And I think it's one of these panic situations, the word got out, Washington Mutual's in trouble. I think that was the bank. If I'm wrong about that and I'm mistaken, I apologize. But I do seem to recall there was only like one bank run. Had this been the 1930s, there would have been hundreds, thousands of bank runs across the country, which is why that system failed in the 1930s, is because if everybody wants their money back, remember, a bank is a house of cards. It'll come crashing down. And the only thing that really props it up is confidence that that house of cards is stable. It's stable. And there are these little popsicle sticks propping them up as well. That's regulation. So it is more flimsy than what people imagine. And you know, banks go to great lengths to try to prove that otherwise. But we know periodically that the banking industry gets itself in trouble. And I know that one of the conventional wisdoms are that bankers who are really kind of dumb and whatnot may walk themselves into these dark alleys and they get mugged every 20 years or so. That's probably an oversimplification. It's probably due more to competitive pressures and, frankly, inadequate regulation. I think that's the case. And we're going to talk a bit about deregulation as being one of the challenges the government's facing. So the required reserve ratio is what? It's that percentage they've got to set aside. So if it's 10% then, which is 0.1, it means the money multiplier is 10 times, meaning that a 30,000 increase in the money supply is going to result in $300,000 in new money. Not 30,000, but new, but 300. I shouldn't put this in parentheses. That looks like a negative. But 300,000 in new money. After the whole process goes on, where that $30,000 that came from the guy buying a truck means that that customer of the First National Bank is going to use that money to buy a new house or some farm equipment or a riding mower or motorcycle, whatever. And then that's going to cause a restocking cycle on the seller's part. And it's just going to go on and on and on and on until it runs itself down. And so it works its way into the inverse of that particular ratio. So in other words, an increase in the money supply of 330,000 actually creates 300,000 in new money. Once that cycle plays itself out, which could take time, and that has to do with what's called velocity of money. We will get to that a bit later. That's not what we're going to get to today. So that's really the last bit of this. The only reason I got into the whole business, stimulus and $1,400 and government giving money, is because that's really a good sort of introductory explanation for what multipliers are and what they do. But in this case, it's just dealing with the money supply. Okay, so questions about that for me? Okay, well, I want to get into talking about chapter 15 a bit. And I'm going to go and erase all this. And I guess the good news for a lot of you who are watching this in the non-live feed is you can stop this anytime you like and take a look and try to decipher my chicken scratches. And again, I apologize. My handwriting has actually gotten better over time, if you can believe that. And that's maybe hard to believe, but I am going to try to make this next section as easy as possible to understand, and that is this. Before we really get into talking about the Federal Reserve, which we will, I do want to talk about the other side of the market for money. Now, remember, we have talked about this intermittently, really from, I think, week 1 in the class, and that was from the circular flow model, which we return to again and again. And that's the idea. Remember, we have the red arrows of goods and labor being exchanged between households and firms. And then in the other direction with those green arrows, that was the money flow of spending and wages. And that the value of the goods is equal to the value of the spending, and the value of the labor is equal to the value of the wages being paid. Well, we've seen this happen before, so we know that there are money flows that are going on. So the question, and we talked about this idea of the supply of money. We talked about M1 and M2, and that's how we dissect the money supply. Whereas M1 folds into, M1 is a subset of M2. The entire money supply can be represented by M2. But there's a reason why we look at M1. It's because it's what we call hot money. And then when we say hot money, it means it can be spent right away. It's not any kind of money that's tied into any kind of maturity, which is a constraint really on people being able to spend it right away. If you have a certificate of deposit for 5 years or whatever, you're probably not going to be spending that money right away, because the penalty you're going to pay is going to be substantial, usually, or a substantial disincentive to make you want to do it. It's oftentimes something like 6 months of interest. Even though interest rates are extremely low right now, still that's a disincentive to get at it. You probably would rather borrow against that CD than do anything else, particularly if you're going to pay it back fairly quickly, rather than pay the one-time non-refundable, but tax deductible interest penalty for early withdrawal. So M1 is hot money. It's M2 is not, at least the non-M1 portion. So let's come back to let's sort of tie this together here. And we talked about the supply of money, but before we did that, we talked about the uses of money. Remember? And we said that we could define money by what it does, right? And that's one of the defining characteristics. So we've got uses of money. That translates then into the supply of money. The missing piece here that we haven't gotten to is the demand for money. The demand for money. And I've talked just a little bit about this on Tuesday. And again, and when I talked about it on Tuesday, I said that, well, demand for money is not really what you think it is, I think. Because what's really going on with demand for money is that people might say, well, it's infinite, isn't it? I mean, who can have enough money? Who's got enough money? My demand for money is infinite. I want more, I want more, I want more. Well, that's really more, I think, the demand for wealth than it is the demand for money, because holding money in its own right, money as money, may not be what you want to do. Maybe you want to hold that wealth, which money is a form of, in something else, maybe like, I don't know, stocks and bonds, or real estate, or, like rental property, or farmland, or artwork, or jewelry, or collectibles, whatever. All those kinds of things would be wealth. So your demand for wealth might be infinite, and it may not be. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that our individual demands for wealth are probably not infinite, because if they were, I think everybody would have a second job, a third job. We would clip coupons. We'd save money anywhere we can. I think it would be a more dominant feature of our lives, but instead we're busy doing other things like consuming leisure, which has value as well. So when we talk about demand for money, we're not talking about demand for wealth. We're talking about demand for money as money. And by the way, for those of you who might follow the financial press, sometimes you'll see that financial advisors say cash is trash. And that is, you don't want to hold cash. And we've heard this phrase a lot in the last, I guess, 20 years or so, while interest rates have been so low. Why do you want to hold cash and get paid 0.01% or whatever? I mean, I know my savings account paid 0.01%, which is pretty much zero, right? So in other words, and it's probably hyperbole, cash is trash, but the idea is don't hold cash, maybe hold something like stocks or something like that. And actually, what we're going to talk about, we're not so. I know sometimes students want to hear more about the stock market. We don't really talk much about that in this class, but we will talk about the bond market because it's got lots of applicability to the connection between the money supply, the banking industry, and monetary policy as conducted by the Federal Reserve. And why and how the Federal Reserve does that, it's primarily by intervening in the bond market. And we'll talk about the bond market and what it is. But before we do that, let's sort of tie this together. I want to take the first two of these uses of money, and that is immediate exchange, right? Immediate exchange, where we said it solves the barter problem, right? And money, oops, I missed that. No, I didn't. Money as a unit of exchange translates really to M1, doesn't it? And that is, if we want to have money in order to buy things, to buy groceries, to pay utility bills, to buy clothes, whatever, go on vacation, we're not going to probably have it in the M2 form, the M2 form that does not include M1, like a CD. We're not going to buy a 5-year CD with money that we need to use to pay our mortgage payment or student loan payments or buy clothes or whatnot. We're not going to do that, clearly. We're going to keep it in a more liquid form, whether it's cash in our pocket or in our checking account, those so-called transaction accounts. So it's going to be M1, right, for the most part. But money as a store of value is going to be the opposite. So money as a store of value is primarily going to be the non-M1 portion of M2. The non-M1 portion of M2, because remember, oops, the non-M1 portion. Because remember, M2 includes all of M1. So it's the non-M1 portion of M2. M2 being the cumulative value. And again, this was probably a little bit more meaningful several years ago when the government actually had an M1, M2, M3, M4, and there was even one beyond that. That was called L, which I won't even get into those. Instead, the government has decided, let's keep it simple. But it is simple particularly for students, because it really sort of brings back the initial definition of money, beyond just that very generic definition of fiat money created by government as legal tender, not backed by gold or silver. It just is what it is, just pieces of paper or entries in computers. It's got two main uses: medium exchange and store of value. Now, unit of account is the third here, but a unit of account doesn't really translate to the supply of money, and it also doesn't translate necessarily to the demand for money. It just is what it is, okay? It just is what it is. So what about demand for money? What are we talking about here? Again, we're not talking about demand for wealth, we're talking about demand for money as money. So money to be used as a medium of exchange translates to what is known as transactions demand. That is, I want to hold money because I want to make transactions with it. So as a result, we're going to call that D sub T, transactions demand. Demand for money as money. And then money in the store of value, the M2 portion of the money supply, is going to be what we call asset demand. And that is money to be used as an asset, which we're going to call D sub A. Okay? So transactions demand and asset demand. Those are the two forms of the money. And so as a result, demand for money together then is this. Demand for money, which is the sort of broad category here, demand for money, D sub M, equals D sub T plus D sub A. Okay? So total demand for money is transactions demand plus asset demand. And they both link back to the purposes and to the money supply itself. And so this is sort of a nice, sort of a logical continuum here of this discussion. That is the idea of how do we determine the demand for money. Now, when it comes to demand for money, and there's a reason I talked about the bond market earlier, because the question arises beyond just the question of, this idea where people sometimes mistake money for wealth. If they say, hey, so-and-so must have a lot of money. Well, they probably do, but what they really have is a lot of wealth. And so if you're saying, I don't know, Snoop Dogg has a lot of money, well, he probably does have a lot of money, but he's probably got more wealth than money. I have no idea what Snoop Dogg's finances are, but I'm simply saying that we'll use the term money as a euphemism for wealth in general. What we're talking about here is demand for money as money, and supply of money as money, not as anything else. And so this begs the question, demand for money as opposed to what? What are the forms of wealth? Well, beyond artwork and jewelry and farmland, it's specifically demand for bonds, because there's a very definite connection here between those. And we're going to talk much more about the bond market. The bonds are simply long-term IOUs that trade out there in the market, and anybody can buy it or sell them. And it's a very, very active market. And what goes on in the bond market very oftentimes is a harbinger of what is to come in the broader economy. I know that if those of you who are interested in financial markets or maybe finance majors or whatnot, you may have come across the TV show on CNBC, Mad Money. The guy who answered it, Jim Cramer, he talks about the stock market. Well, he's a veteran of the investment firm Goldman Sachs, very large, very old firm in New York City. And he said his mentor, who later became the governor of New Jersey, his name was John Corzine, said, look, the thing you need to understand more than the stock market is the bond market. The bond market is a sign of things to come. It will react ahead of time because it is forward-looking very often. And that is true. And so when we had the stock market crash in 1987, those of us in banking got very worried a few weeks ahead of time because of weird stuff we saw in the bond market and even stranger things that we saw happening with the value of the dollar relative to other currencies. It was a really strange situation, and we sort of knew something bad was going to happen. We just didn't know. And in fact, a lot of us did not know how bad it turned out to be. But within 6 months, the market recovered, and which leads a lot of people to believe don't be too freaked out about financial crises because they will get themselves fixed. I think that the evidence for that is how quickly the financial system recovered from the the depths of a really serious downturn that was caused in 2008, where we saw banks fail. And within a not too short of a period of time, they were back in. I mean, they never shut down. They were, unlike the Great Depression, where they shut down for several weeks. That would be unacceptable today. But they were back up and operating. Okay. All right. So again, we talked about D sub N, demand for money equals transactions demand plus asset demand. What does this look like graphically? So let's talk about this. Let's simply graph transactions demand, and we'll graph asset demand, and we'll graph total demand for money. Okay. This is total demand for money here. And in other words, all money demand for D sub M. Okay. And this is going to be asset demand over here. Oops. Asset demand or D sub A. Transactions demand or D sub T. Oops. Transactions demand. So what are we graphing here? And what kind of graphs are these? Well, in reality, these aren't really terribly different from the PQ graphs that we started back in chapter 3 with. They're really not. We're talking about price against quantity. In other words, price on the vertical, price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, right? So nothing too different there. What is different is the fact, is that we're talking about the market for money as opposed to the market for goods and services. It's still a PQ sort of plane, but we've got a very specific term for the price of money, and that's the interest rate, which we'll call OI, and we've got a very specific definition of quantity, that's quantity of dollars. So quantity of dollars, the interest rate, and the quantity of dollars there, okay? All right, so what about the transactions demand? What is that all about? Okay, so let's think about this. This is going to maybe be a little bit surprising, maybe not, I don't know, but transactions demand basically is this. It is a vertical expression. excuse me, not even a function. The transactions demand is what it is. And if you think about it, it's actually pretty straightforward in terms of explaining why it's vertical. Whatever demand for transactions you've got is whatever amount you've got for transactions. And that, for the most part, most households have more or less the same amount to spend month after month after month. It'll change over longer time periods, but in the very short run, it's not going to change. And again, remember that over 2/3 of demand in the economy is consumer demand, which we have long ago said is very stable. Very stable. And that might surprise people to know that's very stable. But it really is. In fact, we've got systems built in where if you're unemployed, there'll be income support systems where you can maintain some semblance of where you were before. It's not designed to make you whole usually if you're unemployed, but it will support you. And by the way, if you get a windfall of money, you maybe inherit $100,000 from a rich uncle who passed away and whatnot, you're probably not going to maybe spend it right away. At some point, maybe you will, but maybe you'll put it in the bank and say, let me just think about this. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. First of all, you're going to have maybe a tax issue, maybe not. It depends. I know lottery winners, a lot of times where they get astray is they get these big lump sums of cash. I know they're paid out over time, usually as in the form of annuity, like I think it's like a 20-year payout. But still, these are pretty big payouts, and they've got to figure out what to do with it. And if they do generate lots of demand with it, then that's often problematic because there's no more money left. But also they've got tax issues immediately to deal with, and we could do a class session on the lottery, which I'm very much opposed to, mostly because I think it's a disadvantage on people who really don't understand the lottery is really sort of a ripoff. It just is, and there's no two ways around it. And I mean, it can be measured. I can show you how your odds are better of simply working and saving money than winning the lottery. I'm not talking about winning $5 in scratch off. By the way, how many times have you been in line at Circle K or whatever, and somebody's won $5 in the scratch off, and they do what with it? They turn it into 5 more lottery tickets. It's like, oh my God, trying to get that $10 million or whatever, which probably isn't going to happen, frankly. You're probably better off saving your money and whatnot. So anyway, the idea, without me getting off track with regard to lottery, is transactions demand is relatively fixed, at least in the short run. That is, most people spending, and even business spending for that matter, is relatively fixed. Think about most businesses. What is one of the biggest expenses to most businesses? It's payroll, and payroll expense is relatively fixed. Most, yes, there are businesses where some of the staff are on commission only, and that is true. That's not generally a very large percentage of the labor force as a whole that earns this variable compensation. Most people wouldn't want to live that way. And I say that way, I know it sounds like it's a bigger deal than it ever has when we hear about the gig economy and all that. That's a new thing, but it's not really that new. And I would be shocked if it's that great of a percentage of the labor force that is engaged in a big percentage of their income from these variable sorts of activities. And in fact, even if the variable compensation is variable, I bet it turns into to be something relatively stable. I used to deliver pizzas when I was in college, and that was mostly commissioned. It was tips, I guess. But it was pretty stable. It was pretty stable. And it was actually pretty good money, given the fact it wasn't anything, there was no work involved. Just here's a pizza, give me a tip for doing whatever, I'm just delivering a pizza. But it was stable. And that's really what the notion is here, is the idea that transactions demand is relatively stable. This differs, however, from, where's my green pen, from asset demand. Asset demand is different. Asset demand is downward sloping. This doesn't sound right. It sounds like it should be the other way around. It should be upward sloping. As the interest rate goes up, maybe I want to chase higher amounts of, I want to hold more money to get more interest. No, it's just the opposite. Why is it downward sloping? It reflects the opportunity cost of holding money as money. As the price of money goes up, why would you want to hold money when you can hold bonds, which are going to yield more than cash is going to yield? As the price of money falls, the opportunity cost falls, and so as a result, you'll demand more money as a result. And I think we have seen this example play out as justification for this downward sloping asset demand. So what is it's the opportunity cost of holding money as money. That's why it's downward sloping. Because if the interest rate is very low, you might as well just park it in a savings account and get very little, but at least you're getting something that's very safe and you can think about it. So $100,000 you get from the dead uncle, maybe you just want to park it here for whatever. But if interest rates go really high, well, why am I keeping it on deposit at Bank of America or wherever? Maybe I want to go and I want to buy a bond with it. And so as a result, the money demand goes this way. This is overall demand for money throughout the economy. I want to move money more into bonds. And so as a result, it's going to go this direction. We're going to hold less money in the form of money. In other words, we're going to exchange money for a security, and that is bonds. Okay. Now, these are mathematical expressions. This is a function. This is actually not technically a function because it fails the vertical line test. Remember, we talked about the idea of what a function is mathematically, without getting too wonky in terms of the math. A vertical expression, which is simply q equals whatever, is not a function because there's no functional relationship. If I is 2, 3, 4, 5, 18, it's the same. It's relatively fixed. That's not a functional relationship. It's independent. Remember, when you've got something that's vertical in a 45 in a 90-degree plane, whatever it's parallel to, it's independent of. So the interest rate has no bearing. And think about this in your own life. When's the last time you said, hey, you know what? I'm not going to pay my P&M bill this month because interest rates are so high. I'm just going to buy a bond and I'll pay it 2 months from now once I've earned a little bit of interest on my money. I'm not saying nobody ever does that. If you've got lots and lots and lots and lots of money, you might do something like that. But most people are probably not going to do that. In fact, there are costs to doing that, and there are risks to doing that, because bonds are not risk-free, even though a lot of people have this idea that they're somehow very safe. They're not that safe, actually. I'm not saying they're extremely risky, stay away, they're dangerous, but you get the idea that they're not completely safe. But despite the fact this is not a function, it's got a mathematical relationship, q equals whatever, plus the functional relationship here. So if you were to add these together, d sub t plus d sub a, you would get a downward sloping demand for money curve or something like that. So demand for money is downward sloping, reflecting the overall opportunity cost of holding money as opposed to holding bonds. Okay, and then one thing we need to introduce here is this, and that is the supply of money. The supply of money is what it is because it's an artificially created thing. It's not gold, which could, as soon as we find new gold, that supply of gold will go this direction, but it's not tied to gold. The supply of money is whatever the supply of money is, okay? So as a result, the supply of money, where the supply of money equals the demand for money, we have the equilibrium interest rate. And we'll call I star, okay? I star. D sub t plus d sub a equals d sub m. And I star is the equilibrium interest rate, which is the short-term state of balance as to the price of money, which we define the interest rate as the rental cost of money. And again, I know that in order to sort of fully explain what we mean by the interest rate, it could be whatever interest rate you like. Although in macro, we would tend to focus on one rate, and it's really the direction of that rate than it is the absolute size of it, because the direction is going to tell us what's going to happen with all interest rates, because they all sort of move in the same direction usually. If there's a trend, that is, they're going to move in the same direction. Hence, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates last week on the so-called Fed funds rate, and immediately mortgage rates went up. And and the mortgage market is very much tied to the bond market, which we're going to see is very, very interest rate sensitive. Okay, so this was a bit of an aside here that talked a bit about the demand for money and the supply of money. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why I got into it, because it's really going to make a difference when we get into talking about monetary policy, which looks like we're probably going to cover mostly on Tuesday. But before we leave today, I will get into some of the basics of the Federal Reserve. I want to do one thing first, though. I want to talk a little bit about the bond market. And I know that we're sort of, we've got one foot in the door of a finance course here, and so I get that, but I think it's really important for us to understand that there's a definite connection between the money market and the bond market, because they're intricately, intimately related. And what goes on in one affects the other, and the bond market is really a harbinger for what goes on really throughout the financial world. And that is this. First of all, let's talk about what a bond is. And there's a slide in your slide package that I mailed out Tuesday morning that talks about what the bond market is. And we define it as a global market for long-term interest-bearing IOUs, basically pieces of paper that are issued by anybody who's borrowing usually large, significant amounts of money, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a government, whether it's a local or state government. They can issue bonds. It could be a foreign government. It could be even a entity of a municipality, like a school district could issue what are known as the municipal bonds. So if I don't know, Gallup Public Schools wants to build a gymnasium, they might do a bond issue in order to raise $20 million or whatever the cost is, in order to be able to finance the purchase. People buy the bonds with they use the cash to build the gymnasium. And by the way, CNN has issued lots and lots of bonds just in the last several years. And in fact, there was good reason to do so. I mean, if you're a borrower, you like low interest rates, which is what we've had. These are fixed interest rates. And so why not go to the bond market and borrow if you've got long-term plans to build new buildings? And if you haven't been on campus a while, drive by and see. There's a lot of new, the wing of the Max Salazar building I'm standing here now is brand new. It's beautiful. And we've got other new structures here. West Side, I've only been to a couple of times since they've built a new structure there. I haven't even been to the Montoya campus lately. But I think I think they tore down one of the buildings and did something there the last few years. I don't get there very often, but that's an example of a particular borrower that would issue bonds in order to do long-term IOUs. Usually they pay interest periodically, and then the principal is repaid at some point in the future. And there are a lot of intricacies in the bond market. I don't want to make this a finance course. I want to link it back to economics. And so the thing that we should know about it for our purposes is there's an inverse relationship between bond prices, which we're going to call P sub B, and the yields on bonds, which are simply the percentage rates of return expressed in percentage terms. And we'll call I sub C. Where does the C come from? It's from what's called the coupon. The coupon is simply, the term coupon is really sort of an outdated term. When bonds were first issued, they used to have, they probably still do, even though a lot of people buy bonds now, and whether it's a bond or a stock, usually your broker will simply hold it for you and will just tell whoever is the so-called transfer agent just to not issue the, I mean, if you buy stock and you buy bonds, you don't have the physical security usually. Almost never do you have that. Back in the day, you used to, though, on the edge of the bond, you have little coupons that were about yay big, and you could clip them every 6 months and give them to your banker, and they would collect the money and put it in your bank account or send you a check or something like that. And coupon clipping was a thing that people did in order to collect interest on bonds, long-term IOUs. Today, it's usually just an automatic thing, and you just tell your broker how you want to get it, and they will collect it for you, and they'll take care of it. It's no big deal. But the term coupon is old-fashioned, but it still exists. It simply refers to that dollar figure that's being paid to you as representing interest. Okay, representing interest. So coupon payments, they're yearly. Sometimes they tend to be every 6 months, but we'll say yearly because everywhere in finance, the interest rate is expressed in annual terms. Again, this is not like the Sopranos where you collect 2% a week from the borrower, and that's not how it works in finance. And certainly no one's going to come after you if you don't pay. I mean, that sort of thing. Well, they'll come after you, but they won't come after you in that way. So you get the idea. These are annual percentage relationships. And so the coupon rate of interest, that is I, which is sub C, is basically equivalent to what? Well, it's the coupon payment in dollars divided by the price of the bond. So C divided by P sub B. A dollar figure divided by a dollar figure is going to give you some percentage. Okay, a dollar figure divided by a dollar figure is some percentage. So as a result, if you get $50 a year in coupon payments divided by $1,000, and that equals 0.05. If you want to get rid of the decimal sign or multiply by 100, you get 5%. And that would be your yield. That's the amount you're getting in a return for a party with $1,000 now. You get $50 per year. Okay, and that's your rate of return. And it's simply, we call it I sub C because that is fixed. These rates of interest are fixed. And remember when we talked about like CNN borrowing, yes, there are variable rate bonds out there. Even our treasury issues those. Excuse me, sometimes to track along with inflation. But for the most part, the bond market issues fixed rate stuff and fixed rate bonds because the issuers, that is the borrowers, want to know what their cost is going to be forever. And when I say forever, what sometimes happens is these bonds are very long-term IOUs, 20 years, 30 years. I've seen 50 years for industrial bonds that have been out there. The British have government bonds that you can go on it, that's fine. The British have bonds that have been out there. They were issued to sort of consolidate all the debt that the government borrowed, the British government borrowed during the Napoleonic Wars, which was what, 200 years ago. And they just had no maturity on it. They just said, there's no maturity, we'll just pay you interest forever. 200 years those bonds have been out there. The British government has got no intention whatsoever of paying them off. And so those bonds are still out there. I don't know that it would be something I would want to own, but they are out there and there are claims on the British government. And by the way, why would they want to pay them off? Because remember, one of the things about inflation is it rewards borrowers over savers. So in inflationary times, the value of money goes down. So why not pay in less expensive dollars in the future for something you can get today? So CNN, we'd rather have a building today and pay back with cheaper dollars in the future. And why not if you can do it, right? So why can't ordinary individuals do it? Well, we're talking about vast amounts of money. You're not going to issue bonds in order to go buy a car or 5 cars for members of your family. Even something like that would not be big enough. So in order to demonstrate the inverse relationship between bonds, let's say this. Let's say that the rate of return, well, let's do a different example here. Let's say this is the one that I used in my notes here. Let's say the coupon is $60, okay? And so as a result, 0.06, and which translates to 6% as an annualized yield. Well, let's say what happens is this. Now, think about what's going on here. And that is the interest rate on bonds will fluctuate with the rate of inflation throughout the economy. And so interest rates in general will go up. And think about this, you need to look no further than what happened last week. What have we been seeing the last, 9 months? Thanks, guys. One thing we've been seeing for the last 9 months is higher prices, higher inflation. So as a result, the interest rate is the price of money, right? And so as a result, the price of money just went up last week. It's going to go up again whenever the Federal Reserve meets again, which is soon. It's going to go up, it's going to go up, it's going to go up. So it tracks along with it. The price of money is going to track along with it. But if you're an issuer of the bond, you will have locked yourself in at the time you did the bond issue. So what happens is this, if you have a 6% bond and you've got this condition where you get 60 over 1,000, you get a 6% yield, right? But what if interest rates go up? And I realize too that there's a little bit more to this, and I don't want to get really off into the tall weeds because there are things like the rating of bonds or bond rating agencies that rate the safety of bonds and whatnot. And so if you are less creditworthy, you pay a higher rate, just like if you're less creditworthy and you go to buy a car at CarMax, you're going to pay a higher rate if they think you're a little bit riskier than if you are solid gold and you got 50% down payment on the car or truck or whatever. Same goes with borrowers in the bond market. If you're more risky, you're going to pay more. So those are factors, but let's just disregard that and other kinds of considerations like creditworthiness and all those kinds of things. So what happens if people are not willing to pay $1,000 for $60 per year because interest rates are going up? For the same quality bond, I can get more than $60. Well, in order for me to do that, I'm going to pay less. I'm going to pay $940. But I'm going to still get the $60 back. And so what happens now is I earn a rate of return of 0.0638 or 6.38%. Because why? Because interest rates in the economy are going up. And so as a result, new bonds are going to pay a higher rate. In order for me to buy this old bond that was 6%, I'm going to have to pay less for it. That's the only way I'm going to buy it is I'm going to pay less for it. And that will push my yield up because I pay less for it. So I'm going to get more. So in other words, what has gone on here? The yield has gone up and the price has gone down. The yield has gone up and the price has gone down. But what if interest rates fall through the floor and they've been pushed down low for whatever reason? And that 6% looks pretty darn good. In fact, I'm willing to pay, not only am I not willing to pay I'm willing to pay up to $1,080 for that same $60. And as a result, my yield now becomes 5.56%. In other words, my yield has gone up while my price has gone up. Because interest rates in the economy are lower now, And so for me to capture, I can either buy a new bond paying 5.5, or I can buy the old bond. But if I'm going to but if somebody's going to sell it to me and give up 6%, which is higher, or $60 a year, which is higher than the current 5.5, they're going to want more money for it. So I'm going to pay more for it. So what is going on? There's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. The interest rate goes up, the bond price goes down. The interest rate goes down, the bond price goes up. And this looks like a demand function, doesn't it? Looks like the law of demand for bonds, and it is. And what's the point of all this? The point of all this is it's going to make sense when we get into talking about monetary policy. Because why? Because when the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, is looking to influence the supply of money in the economy, and we're going to define monetary policy as managing the supply of money and the availability of credit. They're going to do it in the bond market, and they are very much aware of these dynamics. That is, if they're buying bonds, they're going to push the price of bonds up in order to push rates down. This is what happened in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. The Federal Reserve was buying massive amounts of bonds, and even beyond their traditional bailiwick of government bonds and agency bonds like Fannie Mae securities and Sallie Mae student loan debt that was packaged together. They were buying things like mortgage debt, credit card debt, and all these other things. And as they're in, like the demand for anything, if they're demanding more of anything, the price of that thing goes up. And so the yield of those bonds goes down. That was the way they were pushing interest rates down. That's why the interest rate environment has been so low, is because of that. You could argue that maybe they overshot the mark and pushed rates so low that everybody and their brother now was borrowing money in order to buy houses and cars and all this kind of thing. And then, and this maybe contributed some to the inflationary problem. Maybe. I think the jury's a little bit out on that. But right now, these are the dynamics the Federal Reserve is aware. Also, if they want to raise interest rates because they want to slow things down, they're going to do what they're doing now. They're going to start selling bonds. They're going to dump bonds in the market. In other words, they'll put bonds in the market. People will buy them. They'll take the cash out, and the money will go out of the economy. If you're selling anything, the price of that thing goes down. If the price goes down, it drives the interest rate up, and that is what's happening at this very moment. The Federal Reserve is intervening in order to push rates up, in order to cool the economy off. Hopefully, we will see the results of that, okay? So any questions about monetary policy? This was a little bit technical, I get that. The good news is that it's saved as a file, a video file you can look at and review and whatnot. Some of this is not necessarily covered in your book, but I think it's a necessary step in order for us to get to the tools of monetary policy, which is really the main thrust of Chapter 15. When we come back on Tuesday, I will talk a bit about the Federal Reserve. I didn't get to it today. Talking about what some of the functions are. They do a lot of things. It's not just intervening in the bond market in order to influence money and the availability of credit. They do a lot of other things as well. And we'll talk a bit about that. We'll talk a bit about the structure of the Federal Reserve. But the main thing we'll be talking about is what their macroeconomic effects are based upon what their intentions are in order to sort of reach a stabilization of the economy of non-inflationary full employment. That's really the goal. Full employment with stable prices. That's the objective pretty much at all times of macro policy. And when we're out of whack, we try to get ourselves back in whack through monetary policy as one tool. And then we'll get into talking about fiscal policy, the other element. And that'll be the last of the topics we talk about in macro. Yes. Okay. I'm clapping for you there. So, okay. All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. I will see you next time. If you have questions about anything, feel free to contact me individually. I'll be available all weekend. More than glad to talk to you. And but have a great weekend. Okay. Bye-bye.